Welcome back to Spartan Slumber, where epic God of War lore meets the perfect atmosphere for rest and relaxation. I'm your host, and tonight we're diving deep into one of the most pivotal moments in all of mythology, the very first divine blood spilled by the Ghost of Sparta himself. Before we begin this legendary tale, please let me know in the comments which country you're watching from. I love seeing our global community of mythology enthusiasts, and if you enjoy falling asleep to epic lore, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more divine content. In the depths of ancient Greece, when gods still walked among mortals and divine law seemed absolute, there existed a truth so terrible that even the Oracle of Delphi dared not speak it aloud. On a night when the very foundations of Olympus would crack, when immortal blood would first stain mortal ground, the cosmos itself would witness the birth of something unprecedented, a ghost, a god killer, the end of divine invincibility forever. They called him Kratos, the Spartan captain blessed by Ares himself. But that blessing would become the most catastrophic curse in all of mythology. For in the blood-soaked chronicles of divine history, no moment carries more weight than the night a mortal's blade found the heart of a god, and in doing so, shattered the fundamental laws of existence itself. When Olympus still held dominion over the Mediterranean world, long before the ruins and ash that would mark its downfall, Ares the god of war commanded armies that stretched from the frozen peaks of Thrace to the burning sands of Egypt. His champion walked among men with divine fire burning in his veins, the blades of chaos chained to his very soul, an instrument of war so perfect that even Zeus himself took notice. Yet ancient texts, buried beneath the rubble of fallen temples, speak of something far more sinister than simple divine favor. The most learned scholars of mythology have pieced together fragments of that terrible night, when the screams that echoed from the realm of the gods were not cries of victory, but of existential terror. For the first time in the history of creation, immortal flesh had been pierced by mortal steel, and the implications would ripple through every pantheon, every realm, every corner of the divine hierarchy. The night Kratos killed Ares was not merely the death of a god, it was the death of godhood itself as an absolute concept. Archaeological evidence discovered in the deepest vaults beneath Mount Olympus tells a story that contradicts every hymn, every prayer, every sacred text ever written about the untouchable nature of divine beings. Tablets inscribed with urgent warnings speak of prophecies deliberately hidden, of oracles silenced, of a truth so dangerous that Zeus himself ordered it erased from mortal memory. But fragments remain, scattered across the ancient world like breadcrumbs, leading to a revelation that would make even the Titans tremble. The Oracle of Delphi, in her most cryptic utterances, spoke of a warrior marked by ash and flame who would bring about the twilight of the gods themselves. But what she never revealed was that this marked warrior had been created by the very deity he would destroy. Ares, in his insatiable hunger for the perfect weapon, had forged the instrument of his own annihilation. The irony was lost on none, save the god of war himself, who remained blind to the prophecy, even as it consumed him from within. In the days before that fateful confrontation, divine politics had reached a boiling point that threatened to tear Olympus apart from the inside. Athena watched her brother's growing obsession with his mortal champion with increasing alarm, while Zeus remained willfully ignorant of the cosmic storm brewing in his own family. The other gods whispered among themselves of strange omens, of mortal prayers going unanswered, of sacrificial flames that burned with unnatural colors. Something fundamental was shifting in the divine order, and the source was a single Spartan warrior consumed by vengeance. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this tale lies not in the violence itself, but in its inevitability. Ancient Mesopotamian texts, predating even the rise of Olympus, speak of a cycle as old as creation itself. Gods rise, gods become corrupt, Gods fall to those they once ruled. The death of Ares was not an aberration in divine history. It was the fulfillment of a pattern that had repeated since the dawn of consciousness itself. Kratos was not the first god-killer. He was simply the most devastating. The night Athens burned while gods battled above the mortal realm, reality itself bore witness to something that should have been impossible. Divine blood, golden and radiant, pooled on Mediterranean stone for the first time in the history of existence. The very atoms of creation recoiled at this violation of cosmic law, sending shockwaves through dimensions that mortal minds cannot comprehend. Every deity in every pantheon felt that moment, the exact instant when their supposed immortality revealed itself to be nothing more than an elaborate lie. Modern discoveries in the ruins of ancient temples have revealed depictions of that night etched into stone with a precision that speaks of eyewitness accounts. Frescoes show not just the battle between Kratos and Ares, but the faces of other gods watching in horror as their fundamental assumptions about existence crumbled before their eyes. These are not artistic interpretations but documentary evidence of the moment divinity itself was proven mortal. The consequences of that single night would echo through centuries, inspiring fear in pantheons that had never even heard the name Kratos. Egyptian gods would whisper of the Ghost of Sparta in their most secret councils. Norse deities would craft prophecies around the concept of divine mortality. Even distant mythologies would incorporate the tale of the god-killer into their own legends, recognizing the universal significance of what had occurred. Yet perhaps the most terrifying aspect of this moment was not what it meant for the gods, but what it revealed about the nature of power itself. For if gods could die by mortal hands, if divine law could be broken by human will, then what else might prove vulnerable to those brave enough to challenge the seemingly impossible? The death of Ares was not just the end of a deity, it was the beginning of a new age where nothing, no matter how powerful or ancient, could claim absolute dominion over the fate of existence. Tonight we delve into the complete tale of how a Spartan captain became something more terrifying than any god, and in doing so forever changed the rules by which all beings, mortal and divine alike, must live and die. Before Olympus rose to dominance, before Zeus claimed the throne of heaven, before mortals even dreamed of challenging divine authority, the cosmos existed in a state of primordial chaos that would make the later god wars seem like mere skirmishes. In those ancient days, when titans ruled over a young and violent universe, the very concept of divine immortality was forged in the fires of cosmic rebellion. The Titanomachy, that legendary war between the old gods and the new, established more than just political dominance over creation. It created the fundamental laws that would govern divine existence for millennia to come. When Zeus cast his father Kronos into the depths of Tartarus, he did more than claim a throne. He established the sacred principle that gods were beyond the reach of mortal weapons, beyond the touch of death itself, beyond the consequences that plagued lesser beings. Yet even in those triumphant moments, as the Olympians divided the world among themselves, ancient prophecies whispered of a different fate. Gaia, the Earth Mother, whose wisdom predated even the Titans, spoke in riddles of a marked warrior who would one day break the chains of divine invincibility. Her words were dismissed as the ravings of a defeated generation, but they contained a truth that would prove more devastating than any weapon forged in the cosmic furnaces of creation. The establishment of divine law was not merely a political decision, but a restructuring of reality itself. When the Olympians declared themselves immortal, they wove that immortality into the very fabric of existence. Mortal weapons could not harm divine flesh. Mortal strength could not match godly power. Mortal will could not override divine command. These were not simply rules, but fundamental aspects of how the universe functioned, as unchangeable as the rising of the sun or the flow of time itself. But even as these laws solidified into cosmic certainty, cracks began to appear in their foundation. The youngest of the Olympians, Ares, had been shaped by the violence of the Titan War in ways that his siblings could never fully understand. Where Athena learned wisdom from conflict, and Poseidon gained mastery over the seas, Ares absorbed something far more dangerous. He learned that violence was not merely a tool but a force of nature unto itself, capable of reshaping reality according to its own brutal logic. The god of war's understanding of conflict went beyond strategy or strength. He grasped the fundamental truth that war was not about victory or defeat, but about transformation. Every battle changed those who participated in it, not just in body or mind, but in their very essence. This knowledge would prove crucial when he later chose a mortal champion, for Ares alone among the gods understood that the right kind of warfare could change even the unchangeable. As the centuries passed, and Olympus grew in power and influence, the memory of the Titanomachy began to fade from divine consciousness. The gods grew comfortable in their invincibility, assured that the laws established by their victory were as permanent as the mountains themselves. They forgot that those laws had been created through violence, and therefore could potentially be unmade through violence as well. This forgetfulness would prove to be their greatest weakness when faced with a mortal who refused to accept the limitations placed upon him. The peaceful divine order that followed the Titan War hid a violent destiny that none could foresee. Zeus, paranoid about prophecies of his own downfall, focused his attention on threats from other gods, while remaining blind to the possibility that danger might come from below rather than from within Olympus itself. His protective laws, designed to safeguard divine supremacy, created a false sense of security that would ultimately contribute to the gods' destruction. Ancient texts, recovered from the ruins of Titan strongholds, speak of experiments conducted during the early days of Olympian rule, attempts to test the limits of the new divine laws. These experiments, ordered by Zeus himself, confirmed that mortal weapons were indeed powerless against divine flesh, that mortal strength could not overcome godly might, that mortal will could not challenge divine authority. But these tests were conducted using ordinary mortals, not warriors forged in the crucible of divine favor and supernatural rage. The primordial forces that shaped the universe during its violent birth never truly disappeared, but merely went dormant, waiting for the right catalyst to awaken them once more. The establishment of divine law had pushed these forces into the background of existence, but they remained part of the fundamental structure of reality. When the time came for those laws to be challenged, these ancient powers would stir once more, recognizing in a certain Spartan warrior the same revolutionary spirit that had once toppled the Titans themselves. Gaia's prophecy contained layers of meaning that would only become clear in retrospect. The marked warrior she foresaw was not simply someone who would kill gods, but someone who would embody the return of primordial chaos to a universe that had grown too ordered, too comfortable, too certain of its own permanence. The ash that would mark Kratos was not just a curse, but a connection to the fundamental forces of destruction and renewal that had shaped the cosmos since its beginning. The cosmic balance that made gods untouchable to mortal weapons was itself based on a kind of faith, a collective belief in divine supremacy that had been reinforced through centuries of unquestioned dominance. But faith, no matter how strong, remains vulnerable to doubt, and doubt could be introduced through the simple act of proving that the impossible was in fact possible. The death of a single god would be enough to shatter the entire framework of divine invincibility. The Olympians' victory over the Titans had established them as the ultimate authority in the universe, but it had also created the precedent that ultimate authority could be overthrown through sufficient force and determination. This precedent lay dormant in the collective memory of creation, waiting for someone with the will and power to act upon it. That someone would prove to be a mortal warrior, driven by grief and rage, to challenge the very foundations of divine rule. As the age of Olympian dominance reached its height, the seeds of its destruction had already been planted in the cosmic laws that sustained it. The same violence that had elevated the gods above all other beings would eventually be turned against them by one who had learned to wield it with a precision and fury that matched their own. The primordial forces that had shaped the universe smiled in recognition as they felt the first stirrings of a familiar chaos, the same revolutionary energy that had once cast down titans and would soon enough topple gods. The stage was set for a confrontation that would not merely change the balance of power between mortals and immortals, but would fundamentally alter the nature of existence itself. The laws established in the aftermath of the Titanomachy would prove to be not eternal truths but temporary impositions, maintained only so long as no one possessed both the power and the will to challenge them effectively. That challenge was coming, carried in the hands of a warrior whose rage burned with the intensity of primordial fire itself. In the warrior culture of ancient Sparta, where boys were forged into weapons before they could properly hold a sword, Kratos emerged as something beyond even Spartan expectations. His prowess in battle was not merely exceptional, but bordered on the supernatural, as if the very spirit of war itself had taken residence in mortal flesh. This was no accident, for the gods had been watching, and one among them saw in this young captain the potential for something magnificent and terrible. The trials that would elevate Kratos from mortal warrior to divine champion began not with glory, but with desperation. Sparta faced annihilation at the hands of a barbarian horde, led by the barbarian king, whose forces outnumbered the Spartan army 10-1. As Kratos stood on the precipice of defeat, watching his beloved warriors fall around him like wheat before the scythe, he made a choice that would echo through the ages. He called upon the gods for aid, offering his service in exchange for the power to save his people. Ares heard that call and smiled with the satisfaction of a master craftsman who has finally found the perfect raw material for his greatest work. The god of war had long sought to create the ultimate warrior, someone who could embody the pure essence of conflict without the weakening influences of mercy or hesitation. In Kratos, he saw not just potential, but destiny itself made manifest. The ritual that followed would bind them together in ways that neither fully understood at the time. The forging of the blades of chaos represented more than the creation of weapons, but the birth of a new kind of existence, one that straddled the line between mortal and divine. These were not ordinary blades blessed by a god, but extensions of Ares himself, forged from the metal of the underworld and tempered in the flames of divine rage. When they were chained to Kratos' forearms, the binding was both physical and metaphysical, creating a connection that could not be severed by any known power. Ares personally descended to mark his chosen champion, an honor unprecedented in the annals of divine interaction with mortals. The god appeared to Kratos not in dreams or visions, but in his full terrifying glory, a being of such power that his mere presence caused the earth to crack and the sky to bleed. The marking ritual that followed transformed Kratos from a mortal who served the gods into something approaching a god who served only war itself. The blades of chaos were more than weapons, but living extensions of divine will, capable of cutting through any material substance and inflicting wounds that transcended the physical realm. They burned with an inner fire that reflected the rage of their wielder, growing more powerful as Kratos' anger intensified. The chains that bound them to his flesh were forged from the same material that held the Titans in Tartarus, making them unbreakable by any mortal means. As divine power flowed through the newly forged connection between god and mortal, Kratos began to change in ways that went far beyond enhanced physical abilities. His strategic mind sharpened to superhuman levels, allowing him to see weaknesses in enemy formations that others would miss entirely. His endurance became seemingly limitless. His strength grew to rival that of mythical heroes, and his speed increased until he moved like a blur across the battlefield. But perhaps most significantly, the divine connection began to erode the barriers that normally separated mortal consciousness from the cosmic forces that shaped reality. Kratos started to perceive the world as the gods did, seeing mortals as pieces on a vast game board, understanding conflicts not as personal struggles but as expressions of universal principles. This godlike perspective would prove both a blessing and a curse, as it gradually isolated him from his own humanity. The transformation of Kratos into Ares' perfect weapon required the systematic elimination of every quality that might interfere with his effectiveness as an instrument of war. Compassion was branded as weakness, mercy as inefficiency, love as a vulnerability to be exploited by enemies. The god of war methodically reshaped his champion's psyche, removing every emotional impediment to absolute ruthlessness, while amplifying the rage and determination that made him so devastatingly effective. This reshaping process was not instantaneous but gradual, occurring over months of divine conditioning that rewrote the fundamental patterns of Kratos' thoughts and reactions. Each battle he fought under Ares' guidance reinforced these changes, making him more efficient, more brutal, more willing to sacrifice anything and anyone for victory. The mortal captain who had once fought to protect his people was slowly being replaced by something that existed solely to wage war. The first stirrings of conflict with Athena emerged during this transformation period, as the goddess of wisdom recognized the dangerous path her brother was pursuing. She attempted subtle interventions, sending dreams and omens designed to remind Kratos of his humanity, but these efforts only served to annoy Ares and intensify his control over his champion. The rivalry between wisdom and war, already ancient among the gods, took on new dimensions as it played out through their competing influences on a single mortal. As Kratos' reputation grew and his victories mounted, other gods began to take notice of Ares' experiment. Some viewed it with admiration, seeing in the transformed Spartan a new model for divine-mortal interaction. Others watched with growing unease, sensing that Ares was pushing the boundaries of what gods should do to mortals in ways that might have unpredictable consequences. None yet realized that they were witnessing the birth of something that would eventually threaten them all. The divine power flowing through Kratos began to manifest in ways that transcended normal human limitations. He could leap impossible distances, survive wounds that should have been fatal, and fight for days without rest. His weapons became extensions of his will, striking with precision that defied natural law. Most unnervingly, he began to develop an intuitive understanding of his enemy's weaknesses, as if divine insight were guiding his strategic thinking. Yet even as Kratos ascended to heights of power that few mortals had ever achieved, the seeds of future conflict were already taking root within him. The divine transformation that made him so effective as a warrior also began to create an internal tension between his mortal origins and his godlike capabilities. He was becoming something caught between two natures, neither fully human nor truly divine, a being whose very existence challenged the established order of creation. The prophetic elements, embedded in Ares' gift, began to manifest in subtle ways during this period. Oracles across the ancient world reported visions of a warrior wreathed in ash and flame who would bring about great changes in the divine order. These prophecies were dismissed by most as the typical ravings associated with divine blessings, but they represented something far more significant, early warnings of a destiny that was beginning to unfold according to patterns established before the foundation of the world. The completion of Kratos' transformation into the perfect divine weapon represented both the fulfillment of Ares' ambitions and the beginning of the god's downfall. In creating an instrument of war so effective that it surpassed even his own expectations, Ares had also created something that possessed the potential to challenge divine authority itself. The very qualities that made Kratos such a devastating warrior, his absolute determination, his refusal to accept defeat, his willingness to sacrifice everything for his goals, would eventually be turned against the god who had forged them. As this phase of divine ascension reached its culmination, the stage was set for the next chapter, in a drama that would ultimately consume gods and mortals alike. Kratos had become more than a champion of Ares, but an embodiment of war itself, a being whose existence challenged the fundamental assumptions about the relationship between divine and mortal power. The perfect weapon had been forged, but like all weapons, it would eventually be turned against its creator in ways that neither could anticipate. The village that would become the site of the most catastrophic tragedy in divine history was unremarkable in every way save one. It housed the family of Ares's greatest champion, the mortal ties that still bound Kratos to his humanity, despite all of the gods' efforts to sever them. On this night, illuminated by torches and shrouded in an unnatural fog that seemed to muffle sound and distort vision, the final phase of divine manipulation would unfold with devastating precision. Ares had orchestrated this moment with the calculated cruelty of a master strategist, understanding that to forge the perfect weapon, he must destroy everything that made his champion anything other than an instrument of pure warfare. The barbarian raid on the village was no random act of violence, but a carefully planned operation designed to place Kratos in a position where his divine conditioning would override his mortal instincts. The fog that clouded his vision was not natural but divine in origin, ensuring that he would strike first and recognize his targets only after the deed was done. In the temple of Athena, where his family had sought sanctuary, Lysandra and Calliope waited with the faith of mortals who believed their husband and father's divine patron would protect them from harm. They could not have known that the very god who blessed their warrior was the architect of their doom, that their deaths were not collateral damage, but the primary objective of the night's violence. The irony was lost on none save Ares himself, who watched from the divine realm with satisfaction as his perfect plan reached its culmination. The moment when Kratos' blade found divine flesh for the first time was not when he killed Ares, but when he unknowingly murdered his own family under divine influence. For in that temple, as his wife and daughter fell beneath the blades of chaos, something fundamental changed in the relationship between mortal and immortal. The blood that spilled was not divine in nature, but mortal. Yet its significance exceeded that of any god's death, because it represented the moment when divine manipulation crossed a line from which there could be no return. As the fog cleared and Kratos beheld the consequences of his actions, the scream that escaped his throat carried such anguish that it resonated through multiple dimensions of reality. This was not merely the cry of a man who had lost his family, but the birth cry of something new and terrible, a being whose grief was so profound that it began to warp the very fabric of existence around him. The gods felt that scream in their divine realm, and knew, though they could not yet articulate why, that something fundamental had changed. The Oracle of Delphi materialized, as if summoned by the cosmic significance of the moment, her presence both miraculous and terrible. The curse she pronounced was not punishment, but prophecy, the binding of ash to flesh that would mark Kratos as something beyond mortal or divine categories. The ash of his family would become part of his very being, a constant reminder of divine treachery that could never be forgotten or forgiven. This was the moment when the Ghost of Sparta was truly born, not through death, but through a kind of living damnation. The reaction of the gods to this unprecedented display of divine manipulation revealed the deep fractures already present within Olympus. Athena, goddess of wisdom and justice, immediately recognized the cosmic crime that her brother had committed and understood its implications with crystalline clarity. A line had been crossed that no amount of divine authority could uncross, a precedent set that would eventually consume them all. Her attempts to intervene, to offer guidance and possible redemption to the newly marked warrior, were as much about preserving the divine order as they were about helping Kratos himself. Zeus, from his throne atop Olympus, observed these events with the growing unease of a ruler who senses that his authority is being challenged in ways he cannot fully comprehend. The curse binding ash to mortal flesh was not merely symbolic, but represented a new kind of divine law, one written not by gods, but by the consequences of their actions. For the first time in his reign, the king of gods found himself witness to something that existed beyond his power to control or undo. The transformation of Kratos from devoted champion to reluctant enemy began at the exact moment he realized the depth of Ares's betrayal. The divine conditioning that had made him such an effective warrior now worked against its creator, as the same absolute determination that had served the god of war so well was turned toward the singular goal of divine retribution. This was not mere mortal anger, but something approaching cosmic fury, a rage so pure and focused that it began to take on characteristics normally associated with divine force itself. The ash that covered Kratos' skin was more than a curse or mark of shame, but a kind of divine branding that identified him as something unprecedented in the history of creation. He was no longer mortal in any meaningful sense, having been touched by godly power in ways that permanently altered his essential nature. Yet he was not divine either, lacking the immortality and cosmic authority that defined godhood. He existed in a liminal space between categories, a being whose very existence challenged the fundamental assumptions about how reality was organized. As word of the village massacre spread throughout the ancient world, carried by survivors and witnesses who could scarcely believe what they had seen, a new kind of fear began to take root in mortal consciousness. If the gods could manipulate their greatest champions into committing such atrocities, what safety could any mortal claim from divine caprice? The relationship between worshipper and deity, already complex and often troubled, took on new dimensions of uncertainty and dread. The immediate divine response to Kratos' transformation revealed the panic beginning to spread through Olympus as the gods grappled with the implications of what Ares had unleashed. Emergency councils were convened, ancient laws were consulted, and prophetic texts were examined for any precedent that might help them understand what they were dealing with. The conclusion they reached was unanimous and terrifying. Nothing like the Ghost of Sparta had ever existed before, and therefore no divine protocol existed for managing the threat he represented. Ares himself remained convinced that his manipulation had succeeded beyond his wildest expectations, believing that the destruction of Kratos' family had finally severed the last ties binding his champion to mortal concerns. He failed to recognize that in destroying those ties, he had also destroyed the primary mechanism by which he controlled his weapon. A Kratos bound by love and loyalty was predictable and manageable. A Kratos driven solely by vengeance was something else entirely, a force of nature that would prove as dangerous to its creator as to any enemy. The cursed ash that marked Kratos began to exhibit properties that defied divine understanding, seeming to absorb and nullify certain types of magical influence while amplifying others. Attempts by well-meaning gods to remove or modify the curse failed completely, as if the ash had become part of reality's fundamental structure, rather than merely a surface marking. This resistance to divine intervention was unprecedented and deeply troubling to beings accustomed to absolute power over mortal affairs. As Kratos began his quest for vengeance against the god who had betrayed him, the cosmic balance that had maintained order between divine and mortal realms started to shift in subtle but significant ways. Prayers went unanswered more frequently, divine blessings proved less reliable, and the invisible barriers that normally prevented mortals from directly challenging gods began to weaken. The ash-covered warrior walking the earth was not just seeking personal revenge, but embodying a fundamental change in the relationship between heaven and earth. The first divine bloodshed had occurred, not through the death of a god, but through the birth of something that existed beyond divine control, a being whose very existence represented the failure of godly authority to maintain absolute dominance over mortal affairs. The Ghost of Sparta was more than an individual seeking revenge, but a living embodiment of every mortal grievance against divine caprice, every prayer gone unanswered, every act of celestial injustice that had ever scarred the relationship between worshipper and deity. In creating their perfect weapon, the gods had accidentally forged the instrument of their own judgment. In the centuries following the establishment of Olympian dominance, the gods reached heights of power and influence that would never again be equaled in the history of divine civilization. From their crystalline palaces suspended between earth and sky, the Olympians commanded not merely the worship of mortals, but the fundamental forces that governed existence itself. Zeus ruled over thunder and sky with absolute authority, while his siblings divided the remaining domains of creation among themselves with the confidence of beings who believed their reign would last until the end of time. The peak of Pantheon power manifested in achievements that reshaped the very structure of reality to accommodate divine will. Poseidon carved new seas from dry land with casual gestures, while Hades expanded the underworld to accommodate the growing populations of the dead. Athena built cities that defied architectural possibility, their towers reaching toward the heavens in spiraling impossibilities of marble and gold. Artemis created forests where time moved differently, allowing a single hunt to last for decades, while only moments passed in the mortal world. Yet perhaps the most significant divine achievement of this golden age was the establishment of a complex system of divine politics that allowed the gods to maintain their supremacy without constant warfare among themselves. Elaborate protocols governed divine interaction, from formal councils held in Zeus's throne room to informal alliances forged during elaborate celestial banquets that lasted for centuries. These political structures created an illusion of harmony that masked the growing tensions beneath the surface of divine society. The relationship between the gods during this period was characterized by a delicate balance of competition and cooperation that kept their immense powers focused outward toward the expansion of divine influence rather than inward toward mutual destruction. Zeus maintained his position as king, not through raw power alone, but through careful manipulation of divine politics, ensuring that potential threats to his authority were neutralized through complex webs of obligation and mutual dependence. Ares occupied a unique position within this divine hierarchy, serving as both the embodiment of necessary conflict and the scapegoat for the violent impulses that his siblings preferred to deny within themselves. His domain over war made him essential to divine expansion and mortal control, yet his brutality and lack of subtlety made him an object of disdain among gods who prided themselves on more sophisticated approaches to power. This isolation would prove crucial in shaping his later decisions regarding mortal champions. The hidden corruption within the divine order began as small compromises in divine principle, barely noticeable deviations from the high ideals that the gods claimed to represent. Zeus's paranoia about prophecies led him to preemptively eliminate potential threats, often destroying innocent mortals whose only crime was being mentioned in cryptic oracular utterances. Poseidon's anger at perceived slights resulted in devastating floods that wiped out entire civilizations. These actions were justified as necessary for maintaining divine authority, but they represented a gradual erosion of the moral foundation upon which godly rule was supposedly based. Athena alone among the Olympians seemed to recognize the dangerous trajectory of divine development. Though her attempts to counsel restraint were dismissed as unnecessary wisdom-mongering by siblings drunk on their own power, her understanding of strategic thinking allowed her to see patterns that escaped her more impulsive relatives, particularly the way that divine overreach was creating the conditions for eventual rebellion. Yet even her formidable intellect could not fully anticipate the specific form that rebellion would take. The expansion of divine influence during this golden age created a network of temples, oracles, and sacred sites that stretched across the known world and beyond. Each temple served not merely as a place of worship, but as a node in a vast system of divine surveillance and control that allowed the gods to monitor mortal affairs with unprecedented precision. This infrastructure would later prove both a strength and a weakness when divine authority came under direct challenge. The establishment of divine law during this period created elaborate codes, governing everything from proper sacrificial procedures to the treatment of divine messengers. These laws were presented to mortals as eternal truths handed down from beings of perfect wisdom, but they were actually the products of divine committee meetings and political compromises. The gap between divine pretension and divine reality grew wider with each passing century, creating internal contradictions that would eventually undermine the entire system. Mortal subjugation reached its most sophisticated form during the height of divine power, as the gods developed increasingly subtle methods of controlling human behavior without resorting to obvious displays of supernatural force. Divine dreams and visions guided mortal rulers toward decisions that served godly interests, while carefully orchestrated omens and prophecies shaped the development of entire civilizations according to divine will. This manipulation was so pervasive that mortals began to lose the capacity for truly independent thought and action. The complex web of divine relationships that maintained Olympian stability also created vulnerabilities that would prove catastrophic when exploited by someone with sufficient knowledge and motivation. Each god's power was balanced against the others through a system of mutual dependencies that meant the fall of any major deity would send shockwaves through the entire pantheon. The gods had created a structure so interconnected that damage to any part threatened the integrity of the whole. Divine jealousy, beneath the veneer of cosmic glory, manifested in increasingly elaborate schemes designed to diminish rivals while maintaining the appearance of familial harmony. Aphrodite's manipulation of mortal love affairs often targeted the followers of other gods, while Apollo's plagues struck regions that showed insufficient appreciation for his musical talents. These petty conflicts consumed enormous amounts of divine attention and energy that might otherwise have been directed toward recognizing and addressing genuine threats to divine authority. The growing divine hubris during this period blinded the gods to warning signs that would have been obvious to more humble beings. Prophecies that spoke of divine downfall were dismissed as impossible paradoxes, while oracles who delivered unwelcome messages were punished or replaced with more compliant seers. The gods' certainty in their own invincibility became so complete that they lost the ability to conceive of scenarios in which their power might be challenged successfully. The methods of divine control contained within them the seeds of their own destruction, as the very techniques used to dominate mortals also created the conditions under which extraordinary individuals might arise. Divine blessings designed to create loyal servants sometimes produced champions whose power approached godly levels, while divine curses intended as punishment occasionally forged beings capable of matching divine fury with their own. The gods' inability to anticipate these unintended consequences reflected their fundamental misunderstanding of the forces they sought to control. The Golden Age reached its zenith just as the first cracks began to appear in its foundation, though these flaws remained invisible to all save the most perceptive observers. The system of divine dominance had become so complex and far-reaching that its inevitable collapse, when it came, would be correspondingly catastrophic. Every achievement of this period, every expansion of divine power, every refinement of godly control over mortal affairs, contributed to building a structure so vast and interconnected that its destruction would reshape the fundamental nature of reality itself. Prophetic warnings that emerged during the height of divine power were systematically ignored or suppressed, as the gods refused to acknowledge the possibility that their golden age might contain the elements of its own termination. Oracles who spoke of marked warriors and divine bloodshed were dismissed as deluded, their prophecies filed away in divine archives where they gathered dust, while the events they foretold began to unfold in the mortal realm. The gods' blindness to these warnings would prove to be one of their most fatal characteristics, ensuring that when the true threat emerged, they would be completely unprepared to meet it effectively. The expansion of Olympian authority beyond the Mediterranean basin represented more than mere conquest, but a fundamental reshaping of reality, according to divine vision. As the gods extended their influence across vast territories, they encountered other pantheons, older powers, and primordial forces that had ruled these distant lands since the dawn of civilization. The conflicts that arose from these encounters would establish patterns of divine behavior that would ultimately contribute to the downfall of godly authority itself. The divine philosophy that drove this expansion was based on the unshakable conviction that Olympian rule represented the natural order of existence, that Zeus and his siblings were destined to govern not merely the Greek world, but all of creation. This belief was so deeply ingrained in divine consciousness that alternative forms of religious or mystical authority were viewed not as legitimate differences, but as aberrations to be corrected through force. The gods approached expansion with the fervor of missionaries, convinced of their absolute righteousness. Mortal subjugation took on new dimensions as divine influence spread into regions with different cultural traditions and religious practices. The Olympians discovered that direct conquest was often less effective than gradual assimilation, slowly replacing local deities with Greek gods who possessed suspiciously similar attributes and domains. This process required generations of careful manipulation, as divine agents worked to convince mortals that their traditional gods had always been aspects of the true Olympian deities. The expansion process revealed significant differences in how individual gods approached the exercise of power over foreign territories. Athena favored intellectual conquest, establishing schools and libraries where Greek philosophy gradually displaced local wisdom traditions. Poseidon preferred demonstrations of raw power, using earthquakes and tidal waves to convince coastal populations of his supremacy over their traditional sea gods. Ares, characteristically, relied on direct military intervention, supporting Greek armies in their conquest of foreign lands. Other pantheons' reactions to Olympian expansion ranged from immediate hostility to cautious diplomacy, but none welcomed the systematic displacement of their traditional authority. The Egyptian gods, ancient beyond Olympian comprehension, responded with subtle curses that would manifest decades later in seemingly unrelated divine misfortunes. Norse deities, still young and violent themselves, met Greek expansion with direct military resistance that resulted in cosmic battles whose echoes still reverberate through distant dimensions. The resistance movements that arose in response to divine expansion often took forms that the gods found difficult to counter effectively. Mortal champions blessed by displaced deities proved surprisingly effective at disrupting Olympian plans, while entire cultures developed religious practices specifically designed to protect them from Greek divine influence. These resistance efforts, while ultimately unsuccessful in preventing Olympian dominance, established precedents for mortal defiance that would prove significant in later conflicts. Growing divine hubris during this period manifested in increasingly reckless displays of power designed to intimidate potential opponents and impress resistant populations. Gods who had once been content to work through mortal intermediaries began appearing directly to enforce their will, revealing themselves in forms of terrible beauty and overwhelming power. These demonstrations were effective in the short term, but created long-term problems by familiarizing mortals with the actual appearance and behavior of divine beings. The blindness that characterized divine expansion efforts reflected the gods' fundamental inability to understand perspectives other than their own. Local religious traditions were dismissed as primitive superstitions rather than legitimate expressions of different approaches to cosmic truth. This cultural arrogance prevented the gods from recognizing the genuine wisdom contained within some of these traditions, wisdom that might have helped them avoid the catastrophic mistakes that lay ahead. Divine expansion created enemies whose existence the gods barely acknowledged, let alone properly understood. Displaced deities did not simply disappear when their worshippers were converted to Greek religious practices, but persisted in diminished forms, nursing grievances and plotting revenge across centuries or millennia. These forgotten gods retained enough power to influence events in subtle ways, gradually undermining Olympian authority through barely perceptible acts of sabotage and misdirection. The establishment of divine authority over vast territories required the creation of administrative systems that stretched godly attention and resources to their limits. Each new region demanded temples, priests, oracles, and regular divine intervention to maintain proper worship and prevent backsliding into local religious practices. The sheer scale of these operations meant that the gods were often too busy managing their existing territories to properly evaluate new threats or changes in the cosmic balance. Mortal resistance to divine expansion took increasingly sophisticated forms as populations learned to adapt to Olympian rule while secretly maintaining their traditional practices. Underground religious movements developed elaborate codes and symbols that allowed them to communicate without divine detection, while apparent collaborators secretly worked to preserve forbidden knowledge for future generations. These resistance networks created alternative information systems that the gods could not monitor or control effectively. The divine opposition that emerged from expansion efforts included not only displaced local deities, but also cosmic forces that had been awakened by the disruption of ancient power structures. Primordial entities that had slumbered for ages began to stir as divine expansion destabilized the mystical foundations that had kept them dormant. These awakenings went largely unnoticed by the gods, whose attention was focused on more immediate concerns, but they represented a growing threat to the stability of reality itself. The process of divine expansion revealed fundamental flaws in Olympian understanding of power and authority that would prove catastrophic when those same flaws were exploited by a sufficiently motivated opponent. The gods assumed that superior force automatically translated into legitimate authority, that conquest naturally produced loyalty, and that defeated opponents would eventually accept their new status rather than plotting revenge. Each of these assumptions would prove spectacularly wrong when tested by circumstances the gods had not anticipated. Cultural and religious displacement created vast populations of mortals who outwardly conformed to Olympian religious requirements while secretly harboring deep resentment against their divine conquerors. This hidden anger represented a reservoir of potential energy that could be tapped by anyone capable of offering these populations a realistic hope of freedom from divine tyranny. The gods remained largely unaware of this growing resentment, interpreting outward compliance as genuine acceptance of their authority. The cosmic events that began to challenge divine supremacy emerged directly from the expansion efforts that the gods saw as their greatest triumphs. Each conquered territory, each displaced deity, each suppressed religious tradition contributed to building a network of opposition that would eventually coalesce around a single figure capable of channeling all of this accumulated resentment into effective action. The gods had created the conditions for their own destruction through the very process by which they sought to establish eternal dominance over all of creation. The establishment of Olympian authority across vast territories required the gods to maintain simultaneous awareness of countless different regions, cultures, and potential threats. This dispersion of divine attention meant that when a genuine challenge to godly authority finally emerged, the gods were too scattered and distracted to respond with the focused intensity that might have allowed them to neutralize the threat before it became unstoppable. Their success in conquering the world had made them vulnerable to conquest in return. The first visible failures in divine perfection appeared not as dramatic collapses, but as subtle inconsistencies that most mortals dismissed as misunderstandings of divine will. Prayers that had once been answered with clockwork reliability began to receive delayed or incomplete responses, while divine blessings that should have lasted for generations sometimes faded within decades. These early warning signs were explained away by priests and oracles as tests of faith or temporary divine preoccupation with cosmic matters beyond mortal comprehension. Divine oaths, once considered more binding than the laws of physics themselves, began to demonstrate disturbing flexibility when circumstances proved inconvenient for their makers. Zeus's promise to preserve certain bloodlines was quietly forgotten when those families produced individuals who threatened divine interests, while Poseidon's guarantee of safe passage across specific sea routes was revoked without explanation. When political considerations made those routes strategically important, the gods justified these violations as necessary adaptations to changing cosmic conditions, but they represented fundamental breaks in the trust upon which divine authority ultimately depended. The prophecies that had once provided clear guidance for divine decision-making became increasingly contradictory and obscure, as if the cosmic forces that generated oracular visions were themselves becoming confused or conflicted. Multiple oracles would deliver completely different prophecies about the same events, while individual seers began receiving visions that contradicted their own earlier predictions. This prophetic chaos made it impossible for the gods to plan effectively for future challenges, leaving them reactive rather than proactive in their approach to potential threats. Failed attempts to prevent prophetic fulfillment revealed the extent to which divine power had become constrained by forces beyond godly control. When oracles spoke of threats to divine authority, the gods' efforts to neutralize these threats often created the very conditions that allowed the prophecies to come true. Zeus's attempt to prevent a prophesied son from overthrowing him led directly to the circumstances that produced that son, while Poseidon's efforts to avoid a predicted naval defeat resulted in the strategic mistakes that made that defeat inevitable. Mortal champions, who rose against divine authority during this period, possessed capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between human and godly power. These individuals were not merely skilled warriors or wise leaders, but beings who seemed to exist partially outside the normal rules that governed mortal existence. Their resistance to divine manipulation and their ability to achieve victories against supposedly overwhelming odds suggested that the cosmic laws supporting divine supremacy were not as absolute as previously believed. The emergence of these exceptional mortals was not random, but appeared to follow patterns that the gods could neither predict nor prevent. Individuals who should have been easily controlled or eliminated instead demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability, often turning divine attempts at manipulation against their intended targets. This pattern suggested the operation of cosmic forces that were actively working to produce champions capable of challenging divine authority. Divine explanations for these disturbing developments became increasingly desperate and unconvincing. As the problems multiplied and intensified, the gods claimed that mortal resistance was actually beneficial because it provided opportunities for divine mercy and forgiveness, that prophetic contradictions were deliberate tests of divine wisdom, and that broken oaths were evidence of divine evolution beyond primitive concepts of binding commitments. These explanations satisfied no one and served mainly to highlight the extent to which divine authority was beginning to crumble. The terrible truth hidden beneath these explanations was that the gods themselves no longer understood the forces they claimed to control. The cosmic mechanisms that had once operated with perfect predictability were exhibiting chaotic behavior that defied divine comprehension, while the fundamental laws that supported godly authority were spontaneously generating exceptions and contradictions. The universe itself seemed to be developing an immune response to divine dominance. Prophecies began manifesting in ways that served some cosmic purpose beyond simple prediction, as if oracular visions were not merely describing possible futures, but actively working to bring about specific outcomes. The most disturbing prophecies spoke of cycles rather than singular events, suggesting that divine authority was subject to the same patterns of rise and decline that affected all other forms of power. These cyclical prophecies implied that the current divine order was temporary rather than eternal. The cosmic purpose underlying these prophetic patterns gradually became apparent to those willing to examine the evidence without preconceptions. Divine authority was not a permanent feature of reality, but a phase in an ongoing cosmic cycle that would inevitably give way to new forms of power and organization. The gods represented one temporary solution to the problem of cosmic governance, not the final and permanent answer they claimed to be. Divine problems began to manifest as symptoms of a cyclical pattern that had operated since the beginning of time itself. The same forces that had elevated the gods above the Titans were now working to elevate something else above the gods, following universal principles that no amount of divine power could override. Recognition of this pattern was so threatening to divine self-conception that most gods refused to acknowledge it even when presented with overwhelming evidence. The cyclical nature of cosmic power meant that divine resistance to change was not merely futile, but actively counterproductive, as it created the tensions and contradictions that accelerated the transition to whatever would replace divine authority. The gods' attempts to preserve their dominance indefinitely were generating exactly the conditions necessary for their own downfall, fulfilling prophecies through the very actions intended to prevent their fulfillment. Warning signs that should have prompted divine reform instead triggered increasingly desperate attempts to maintain the status quo through force and intimidation. Rather than addressing the underlying problems that were causing divine authority to collapse, the gods focused on suppressing the symptoms of that collapse, creating a cycle of escalating repression that only accelerated the development of effective resistance movements. The cosmic forces supporting these resistance movements operated according to principles that transcended individual divine power, making them impossible to defeat through conventional godly methods. These forces did not oppose the gods personally, but rather represented universal tendencies toward balance and change that would eventually assert themselves regardless of divine preferences. Fighting these forces was like fighting the rotation of the earth or the passage of time itself. Mysterious developments that the gods could not explain began occurring with increasing frequency across all divine domains, from unexplained failures in divine magic to spontaneous generation of mortal champions with godlike capabilities. These phenomena shared common characteristics that suggested coordination by some intelligence or principle that operated beyond divine detection or control. The gods found themselves reacting to changes they could neither predict nor prevent. Suspicious divine cover-ups became necessary, as the gods attempted to hide the extent of their problems from mortal observation and from each other. Divine councils were held in secret to discuss failures and contradictions that could not be acknowledged publicly, while elaborate deceptions were constructed to explain away obvious divine mistakes. These cover-ups required enormous amounts of divine energy and attention that might otherwise have been directed toward solving the underlying problems. The accumulation of hidden failures and suppressed contradictions created a growing burden of divine dishonesty that undermined the moral foundation of godly authority. Gods who claimed to represent truth and justice were increasingly forced to rely on lies and deception to maintain their positions, creating internal contradictions that made their eventual downfall not merely likely but morally necessary. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would expose these contradictions and force a resolution of the cosmic tensions that had been building throughout the divine age. The gods had created a situation where their authority could be maintained only through increasingly extreme measures that would eventually provoke the very rebellion they sought to prevent. The cyclical forces of cosmic change had identified their instrument of transformation and were preparing to deploy it against a divine order that had grown too rigid and corrupt to adapt to changing cosmic conditions. The transformation of Kratos, from divine servant to cosmic nemesis, began not with a single moment of revelation, but through a gradual awakening to the true nature of the forces that had shaped his existence. The ash that covered his skin served as more than a mark of divine punishment, but as a constant reminder of the price of trusting godly promises. Each day that passed without relief from his torment strengthened his resolve to seek satisfaction through the only means that remained available to him, the complete destruction of the deity responsible for his suffering. Vengeance incarnate took physical form in the person of a warrior who had transcended normal human limitations through divine manipulation and supernatural rage. Kratos possessed all the capabilities that Ares had intentionally cultivated: the strategic brilliance, the physical prowess, the mystical weapons, but these gifts were now directed toward a purpose that their creator had never intended. The perfect instrument of war had been turned against the god of war himself, creating a symmetry that approached cosmic poetry in its terrible appropriateness. The first divine casualties occurred, not through direct confrontation, but through the systematic dismantling of Ares's power base among mortal worshippers. Kratos began targeting temples dedicated to the god of war, slaughtering priests, and destroying sacred artifacts with a methodical precision that demonstrated his intimate knowledge of divine vulnerabilities. Each temple destroyed weakened Ares's connection to the mortal realm and reduced his ability to manifest divine power in the physical world. Divine panic began to spread through Olympus as reports reached the gods of a mortal warrior who seemed immune to their traditional methods of control and manipulation. Attempts to curse Kratos failed as his existing divine marking provided protection against additional supernatural interference. Efforts to turn other mortals against him backfired as his reputation for invincibility grew with each victory. Even direct divine intervention proved ineffective against a being who fought with the fury of the wronged and the skill of the divinely trained. The escalating god-killer rampage that followed demonstrated capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between mortal and divine power. Kratos did not merely defeat enemies blessed by gods, but systematically hunted down and eliminated beings that possessed partial divine nature themselves. Cyclopes, Medusas, Minotaurs, and other creatures that served as divine intermediaries fell before his blades, with a consistency that suggested access to knowledge or power beyond normal mortal reach. Desperate measures adopted by various gods to protect their servants and interests revealed the extent of divine fear regarding this unprecedented threat. Zeus authorized the use of forbidden magic to create barriers that should have been impenetrable to mortal attack, while Poseidon redirected ocean currents to prevent Kratos from reaching certain islands where important divine assets were hidden. These extreme interventions violated established protocols for divine non-interference in mortal affairs, but were deemed necessary given the extraordinary circumstances. The god-killer's rampage created ripple effects throughout the divine hierarchy as individual gods began to question their own vulnerability to similar attacks. If Ares, one of the most powerful Olympians, could be threatened by a mortal champion, what protection did lesser deities possess against determined human opposition? This crisis of confidence led to increased competition among gods for divine resources and protection, fracturing the unity that had previously characterized Olympian decision-making. Ares himself initially dismissed the threat posed by his former champion, assuming that divine superiority would ultimately prove decisive in any direct confrontation. The god of war's arrogance prevented him from recognizing the true extent of Kratos' transformation and the cosmic forces that were beginning to align behind the mortal warrior's quest for vengeance. This blindness would prove to be a fatal flaw that prevented effective countermeasures from being implemented before the situation became irreversible. The unstoppable effectiveness of vengeance as a motivating force became apparent as Kratos demonstrated capabilities that exceeded even divine expectations regarding mortal potential. His strategic planning rivaled that of Athena herself, while his combat skills approached levels that had previously been considered exclusive to divine beings. The combination of supernatural enhancement and absolute determination created a warrior whose effectiveness transcended normal categories of mortal achievement. The systematic nature of Kratos' campaign against divine authority revealed an understanding of godly vulnerabilities that could only have come from intimate knowledge of divine nature and operations. His attacks targeted not just Ares, but the entire infrastructure that supported divine power, from oracle sites that provided prophetic guidance to sacred groves where gods communicated with mortal agents. This comprehensive approach suggested guidance from sources beyond his own experience and knowledge. Pyrrhic victories began to characterize divine attempts to contain the god-killer threat, as each successful intervention came at enormous cost in divine resources and credibility. When gods were forced to manifest directly in the mortal realm to counter Kratos' actions, they revealed their true forms to human witnesses, and thereby destroyed the mystery and distance that were essential components of divine authority. These exposures weakened all gods, not just those directly involved in the confrontations. The burning of realms began as collateral damage from the cosmic conflict between Kratos and the divine establishment, but escalated into systematic destruction that threatened the foundations of civilization itself. Cities allied with Ares found themselves under attack not just from the god-killer, but from natural disasters and supernatural plagues that seemed to follow in his wake. The boundaries between divine and mortal conflicts began to blur as the war spread beyond its original scope. The threat's proven ability to kill immortals became undeniably apparent when Kratos began successfully eliminating beings that possessed aspects of divine nature. Creatures that had been considered unkillable by mortal weapons fell before the blades of chaos, while entities that existed partially outside normal reality found themselves vulnerable to attack from someone who operated according to rules that transcended conventional limitations. These victories established precedents that would prove terrifying to beings who had considered themselves beyond mortal reach. The cosmic forces that had begun aligning behind Kratos' quest for vengeance revealed themselves through increasingly obvious manifestations of supernatural support. Weapons appeared when needed, paths opened through seemingly impassable obstacles, and enemies revealed fatal weaknesses at crucial moments. This pattern of assistance suggested coordination by intelligence or principle that operated beyond divine detection and control, implying that Kratos was not acting alone but as an agent of cosmic forces seeking to rebalance divine and mortal power. Divine countermeasures grew increasingly desperate as traditional methods proved ineffective against a threat that seemed to anticipate and counter every strategy employed against it. Gods who had never collaborated began forming unprecedented alliances, while ancient taboos were violated in desperate attempts to generate sufficient power to neutralize the god-killer. These extreme measures often created new problems that were worse than the original threat, accelerating the breakdown of divine authority rather than preserving it. The realization that mortal will could override divine command when backed by sufficient power and determination sent shockwaves through every pantheon in existence. Reports of the god-killer's activities spread beyond the Greek sphere of influence, inspiring fear in Egyptian, Norse, and other divine establishments that had previously considered themselves immune to mortal challenge. The precedent being established by Kratos' campaign threatened the fundamental assumptions upon which all divine authority was based. The approaching confrontation between vengeance incarnate and the god of war himself began to take on cosmic significance, as various supernatural forces positioned themselves to influence or benefit from the outcome. Ancient prophecies that had been dismissed as metaphorical began to manifest literal fulfillment, while dormant mystical energies awakened in response to the approaching climax. The battle between Kratos and Ares would determine more than personal satisfaction, but the future relationship between divine and mortal power throughout all of creation. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shatter the illusion of divine invincibility forever, and establish new principles governing the exercise of cosmic authority. The perfect weapon created by Ares was about to be turned against its maker in a battle that would determine whether gods could continue to claim absolute dominion over the forces they sought to control. The rising vengeance had become an unstoppable force that would reshape the fundamental nature of reality itself. The abandonment of divine laws and sacred taboos began as emergency measures but quickly escalated into wholesale violations of cosmic principles that had governed divine behavior since the foundation of Olympus itself. Zeus, faced with a threat unlike any in his reign, authorized the use of forbidden magics that had been banned since the Titanomachy for their dangerous and unpredictable effects. These desperate innovations exceeded all safe limits as the gods prioritized immediate survival over long-term cosmic stability. Sacred protocols that had maintained divine dignity and mystery for millennia were discarded as gods began manifesting directly in the mortal realm with increasing frequency and decreasing subtlety. The carefully maintained separation between divine and mortal spheres collapsed as Olympians abandoned their traditional preference for working through intermediaries and began taking direct action against the god-killer threat. These violations of established divine protocol damaged the mystique and authority that were essential components of godly power. Forbidden alliances formed between gods who had been enemies or rivals for centuries, as the severity of the crisis forced unprecedented cooperation among divine beings who normally competed for worship and influence. Ares found himself receiving support from siblings who had previously viewed him with disdain, while even Zeus set aside his paranoia about divine conspiracies to coordinate a unified response to the mortal threat. These alliances represented fundamental shifts in divine politics that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. Dark magic, previously considered too dangerous for divine use, was unleashed without proper understanding of its long-term consequences, as gods prioritized immediate effectiveness over cosmic responsibility. Spells that manipulated the fundamental forces of reality were cast with desperate haste, while curses that drew power from primordial chaos were deployed against a single mortal target. These magical innovations created ripple effects throughout multiple dimensions of existence, destabilizing realities far beyond the immediate conflict zone. The crossing of mythological points of no return occurred as gods violated principles that had been absolute since their rise to power, abandoning moral and ethical constraints that had previously defined the limits of acceptable divine behavior. The systematic elimination of mortal witnesses to divine desperation, the manipulation of fate itself to alter prophetic outcomes, and the deliberate corruption of sacred sites to generate additional power, all represented irreversible steps away from the ideals that had originally justified divine rule. Unintended realm-shattering consequences emerged from divine innovations as the gods discovered that their emergency measures were causing damage to the fundamental structure of reality itself. Temporal anomalies began appearing in regions where forbidden magic had been used, while spatial distortions created pockets of chaotic reality where normal physical laws no longer applied. These side effects were ignored or dismissed as acceptable costs for neutralizing the god-killer threat. The revelation that solutions were creating worse problems than the original threat became apparent as divine countermeasures began generating new categories of cosmic instability that threatened not just divine authority, but the continued existence of organized reality. Each extreme measure deployed against Kratos produced unexpected complications that required even more extreme responses, creating a cascade of escalating interventions that pushed divine power beyond its safe operational limits. Divine innovations that exceeded safe limits included attempts to rewrite fundamental cosmic laws to make divine beings truly immortal rather than merely very difficult to kill. These modifications to basic reality required enormous expenditures of divine energy and created vulnerabilities in other aspects of cosmic structure that were exploited by chaotic forces seeking to expand their influence. The gods found themselves fighting a multi-front war against their original enemy and the unintended consequences of their own desperate measures. The establishment of the moment that sealed Ares' doom occurred when the god of war himself violated the most sacred of divine taboos by attempting to directly manipulate fate to ensure his victory over Kratos. This intervention required him to draw power from primordial sources that predated divine authority and operated according to principles that no Olympian fully understood. The ritual necessary for this manipulation left Ares vulnerable to exactly the kind of attack that Kratos was uniquely positioned to deliver. Theoretical divine limitations that had previously been considered absolute were systematically broken as gods pushed their capabilities beyond all previously established boundaries in desperate attempts to maintain their superiority over mortal challenge. Divine beings who had never fully tested their powers discovered that those powers had limits that could be exceeded through sufficient desperation and determination. These discoveries were terrifying to beings who had believed themselves capable of anything. Cutting-edge mythological revelations emerged as the crisis forced gods to experiment with aspects of cosmic power that they had never previously needed to understand or control. Ancient texts that had been dismissed as primitive superstition were consulted for guidance on managing primordial forces, while long-dormant cosmic mechanisms were activated without proper understanding of their function or purpose. These experiments revealed that divine power was far more complex and dangerous than anyone had realized. Radical divine theories that had been rejected as impossible or blasphemous were suddenly embraced as potential solutions to an unprecedented crisis. The concept that divine and mortal power might be fundamentally equivalent rather than hierarchical gained credibility as Kratos continued to demonstrate capabilities that challenged all traditional assumptions about the nature of godhood. These theoretical shifts represented revolutionary changes in divine self-understanding that threatened the psychological foundations of divine identity. Fringe prophecies and interpretations that had been dismissed by mainstream divine scholarship were suddenly re-examined as potentially accurate descriptions of cosmic processes that the gods had never fully comprehended. Oracular utterances that spoke of cyclical changes in cosmic authority were recognized as descriptions of natural processes rather than impossible paradoxes. These reinterpretations forced gods to confront the possibility that their reign was temporary rather than eternal. Hidden Pantheon conspiracies began to emerge as the crisis revealed secret alliances and hidden agendas that had been operating beneath the surface of divine politics for centuries. Gods who had publicly supported divine unity were discovered to be privately pursuing strategies designed to benefit from the collapse of Olympian authority. These revelations shattered the trust and cooperation that were essential for effective collective action against external threats. The implications of extreme theories becoming reality terrified divine beings who had staked their entire existence on the assumption that certain possibilities were impossible. If mortals could kill gods, if divine law could be violated by human will, if cosmic authority could be transferred through force rather than inheritance, then everything the gods believed about the nature of existence might be fundamentally wrong. These possibilities threatened not just divine power, but divine sanity. Unprecedented godly actions that violated every principle of divine behavior were undertaken as gods abandoned their traditional roles and responsibilities in favor of direct intervention against the god-killer threat. Deities who had never engaged in physical combat personally entered the mortal realm to hunt Kratos, while gods of peace and wisdom participated in planning strategies of unprecedented brutality. These role reversals represented fundamental changes in divine nature that could not be easily undone. The breaking of eternal divine laws that had been considered immutable since the foundation of cosmic order occurred as gods prioritized survival over principle and immediate effectiveness over long-term consequences. Laws that governed divine interaction with mortals, divine responsibility for cosmic stability, and divine respect for natural processes were all violated in desperate attempts to neutralize a single mortal threat. These violations had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate conflict. The moment sealing the Pantheon's doom was established when these desperate measures created exactly the conditions necessary for Kratos to succeed in his quest for divine vengeance. By abandoning their principles and violating their own laws, the gods destroyed the moral authority that had been the true foundation of their power. They became tyrants clinging to dominance through force, rather than legitimate rulers governing through wisdom and justice, making their overthrow not just possible, but necessary for cosmic balance to be restored. The origins of divine treachery that would culminate in the destruction of Ares began not with the god of war's manipulation of Kratos, but with fundamental contradictions in the nature of divine authority itself. The gods had built their dominion on principles they were unwilling to honor when those principles became inconvenient, creating a system of rule based on hypocrisy and deception rather than genuine wisdom or justice. This foundational dishonesty made betrayal inevitable, as gods prioritized personal advantage over cosmic responsibility. Divine civil war erupted not through sudden conflict, but through the gradual breakdown of trust and cooperation that had maintained Olympian unity for millennia. Each god's response to the Kratos crisis revealed hidden agendas and secret priorities that contradicted their public commitment to collective divine welfare. Athena's subtle manipulations, Zeus's paranoid overreactions, and Ares' desperate gambits created a web of conflicting strategies that made unified resistance to the god-killer threat impossible. The build-up to the confrontation between Kratos and Ares took place against a background of divine political maneuvering that would have been worthy of mortal courts in its complexity and ruthlessness. Gods who had publicly pledged support for the god of war privately undermined his efforts in hopes of benefiting from his downfall, while supposed neutral parties secretly provided assistance to both sides in order to ensure that the conflict would weaken all participants. These machinations revealed the extent to which divine cooperation had always been superficial rather than genuine. God turning against God reached its climax as the crisis forced each divine being to choose between loyalty to family and loyalty to self-preservation. Athena's decision to guide Kratos toward Pandora's box represented more than strategic calculation, but a fundamental betrayal of divine solidarity in favor of personal ambition. Her assistance to the god-killer was justified as serving the greater good, but it actually served her own goal of replacing Ares as the primary divine influence over warfare and conflict. Spreading corruption through the Pantheon manifested as gods began adopting tactics and strategies that violated their own stated principles and moral commitments. Deities who had claimed to represent justice and wisdom descended to levels of manipulation and deceit that rivaled anything practiced by the titans they had overthrown. This moral degradation was gradual but inexorable, as each compromise of principle made the next violation easier to rationalize and implement. The oracle's words achieving terrifying fruition occurred as prophecies that had been dismissed as impossible metaphors began manifesting literal fulfillment in ways that no one had anticipated. The marked warrior bringing divine twilight was no longer a symbolic concept but a physical reality, walking the earth with divine weapons in his hands. The fulfillment of these prophecies revealed that cosmic forces beyond divine control had been manipulating events according to patterns that transcended individual will or desire. Athena's true role as the architect of divine destruction was revealed through her systematic manipulation of events to ensure that Kratos would acquire the power necessary to kill Ares, while positioning herself to benefit from the resulting chaos. Her guidance was not motivated by compassion for mortal suffering, but by recognition that divine authority was entering a transitional phase that offered opportunities for those clever enough to position themselves advantageously. She was playing all sides against each other in pursuit of her own elevation to supreme divine authority. The revelation of trusted gods being corrupted by ambition and self-interest shattered the illusion of divine unity that had been essential for maintaining cosmic stability. When it became apparent that individual gods were willing to sacrifice collective divine welfare for personal advantage, the moral foundation of divine rule collapsed entirely. Gods could no longer claim to represent higher principles or cosmic justice when their own behavior demonstrated that they were motivated by the same petty desires and fears that characterized the mortals they claimed to govern. Fundamental mythology was challenged through discoveries that revealed the extent to which divine origin stories and justifications for godly authority were deliberate fabrications designed to support political control rather than accurate descriptions of cosmic truth. The gods had not achieved their positions through superior wisdom or inherent right, but through force and manipulation, making their rule a form of successful tyranny rather than legitimate governance. These revelations made rebellion against divine authority not just justified but morally necessary. The divine conspiracy becoming clear revealed that apparent conflicts between gods had often been staged performances designed to manipulate mortal behavior and maintain the illusion that divine politics operated according to comprehensible principles. The rivalry between Athena and Ares had been partially artificial, a tool for managing mortal populations by providing them with divine representatives of different approaches to conflict resolution. The exposure of these deceptions destroyed mortal faith in divine honesty and reliability. The full scope of divine deception included not just manipulation of mortals, but systematic lies told by gods to each other in pursuit of individual advantage within the divine hierarchy. Zeus's claims about prophetic threats, Ares's justifications for his treatment of mortal champions, and Athena's explanations for her interventions were all revealed to be partial truths, designed to advance personal agendas rather than accurate descriptions of divine motivations and goals. This culture of dishonesty made genuine cooperation impossible when collective action became necessary for divine survival. The betrayal of divine narratives that had sustained cosmic order for centuries occurred as the crisis revealed that fundamental assumptions about the nature of godhood were based on carefully constructed myths rather than objective reality. Divine immortality, divine wisdom, divine justice, and divine benevolence were all revealed to be propaganda concepts rather than actual divine characteristics. This exposure destroyed the ideological foundation that had made divine rule acceptable to mortals and gods alike. Hidden mythological truths emerged as the breakdown of divine authority allowed suppressed information to surface that contradicted official divine accounts of cosmic history and divine nature. Ancient documents revealed that the gods had achieved power through methods they had later condemned as evil, while suppressed prophecies indicated that divine rule was always intended to be temporary rather than eternal. These revelations suggested that the current crisis was not an aberration, but the fulfillment of cosmic patterns that had been established since the beginning of time. The moment when divine facade collapsed completely occurred when Kratos acquired Pandora's box and gained access to power that challenged divine supremacy directly. This event revealed that divine invincibility had always been based on mortal ignorance rather than actual divine superiority, and that gods were vulnerable to the same forces of destruction that affected all other beings. The collapse of this illusion made divine authority impossible to maintain through traditional methods of intimidation and manipulation. The revelation of deliberate deception on a cosmic scale showed that gods had been systematically lying about the nature of reality itself in order to maintain their positions of authority. The relationship between divine and mortal power, the mechanisms of cosmic governance, and the purpose of existence itself had all been misrepresented in ways designed to make divine rule seem natural and inevitable rather than artificial and temporary. This comprehensive dishonesty made the gods' destruction not just politically necessary, but cosmically required for the restoration of truth and justice. The scale of divine deception being exposed reached levels that challenged the fundamental categories of truth and falsehood, as it became apparent that reality itself had been systematically distorted to support divine authority. Natural laws, prophetic visions, and moral principles had all been manipulated to create a false cosmic order that served divine interests rather than universal welfare. The correction of these distortions required not just political change, but ontological revolution that would reshape the basic structure of existence itself. The approaching climax of divine betrayal would occur when all these hidden truths converged in a single moment of revelation that would destroy the last vestiges of divine credibility and authority. The confrontation between Kratos and Ares would serve as a catalyst for the exposure of every lie, every manipulation, and every betrayal that had sustained divine rule since its inception. The gods had created the conditions for their own destruction through their systematic abandonment of the principles they claimed to represent. The divine realm infrastructure began collapsing as the cosmic battle between Kratos and the established order of gods created shockwaves that transcended physical dimensions and damaged the fundamental mechanisms that sustained divine civilization. Crystalline palaces that had floated between earth and sky for millennia began to crack and crumble as the mystical forces holding them aloft were disrupted by the unprecedented nature of the conflict. The very foundations of Olympus itself began to shake as divine power was diverted from maintenance of cosmic order to direct confrontation with an enemy that refused to acknowledge divine supremacy. Gods falling one by one became an inevitable consequence of the systemic weaknesses that the Kratos crisis had exposed throughout the divine hierarchy. Each divine being that fell to mortal attack or divine betrayal weakened the entire Pantheon by demonstrating that godhood provided no protection against sufficiently determined opposition. The psychological impact of these losses was as devastating as their practical consequences, as surviving gods lost faith in their own invincibility and began making increasingly desperate decisions based on fear rather than wisdom. Mortal world consequences intensified dramatically as the divine civil war created chaos that cascaded down from the celestial realm into every aspect of earthly existence. Natural disasters multiplied as gods abandoned their traditional responsibilities for maintaining cosmic balance in favor of pursuing personal survival strategies. Storms raged without divine moderation, earthquakes struck without regard for sacred sites, and plagues spread unchecked as the divine attention necessary for their control was redirected toward internal conflicts. The rapid loss of divine domains occurred as gods proved unable to maintain their traditional areas of authority, while simultaneously fighting for their lives against mortal and divine enemies. Poseidon's control over the seas became erratic, as his attention was consumed by defensive preparations, while Demeter's management of agriculture failed, as she focused on creating hidden sanctuaries where she might survive the coming chaos. This abandonment of divine responsibilities created a cascade of failures that threatened the continued existence of organized civilization. Final desperate divine gambits included attempts to fundamentally alter the nature of reality itself in ways that would make divine beings truly immortal rather than merely very difficult to kill. These experiments with cosmic law required enormous expenditures of divine energy and created unpredictable side effects that often proved more dangerous than the original threats they were designed to counter. Gods who had once been content to work within established cosmic parameters began violating universal principles with increasing frequency and desperation. The irreversible nature of realm damage became apparent as divine interventions designed to prevent further deterioration instead accelerated the breakdown of cosmic order. Each attempt to repair damage caused by previous divine actions created new categories of instability that required even more extreme countermeasures. The gods found themselves trapped in a cycle of escalating interventions that pushed reality itself toward a breaking point beyond which recovery might prove impossible. Divine power infrastructure that had sustained godly civilization for millennia began failing as the energy required for maintaining cosmic stability was diverted toward immediate survival needs. Sacred sites lost their mystical potency as gods withdrew the divine attention necessary for their proper function, while oracular systems collapsed as prophetic visions became too chaotic and contradictory to provide useful guidance. The carefully constructed network of divine influence that had enabled gods to govern reality began to fragment into isolated nodes of rapidly diminishing power. Survivors of divine conflict faced an apocalyptic choice between preserving the failing system that had governed existence since the overthrow of the Titans, or embracing the chaos that would inevitably follow the complete collapse of divine authority. Gods who recognized the futility of resistance began preparing for exile or transformation, while others committed themselves to fighting until the end, regardless of the cost to cosmic stability. This division among divine survivors ensured that no coordinated response to the crisis would be possible. The systematic failure of divine magic occurred as spells and enchantments that had operated reliably for centuries began producing unpredictable results or failing entirely. The cosmic forces that powered divine abilities were being disrupted by the fundamental changes occurring in the relationship between mortal and immortal power. Gods discovered that their most basic capabilities were no longer reliable, making them increasingly vulnerable to attacks that would previously have been easily countered. Realm boundaries that had separated different dimensions of existence began to blur and overlap as divine guardians abandoned their posts to join the civil war, or were eliminated by either mortal or divine enemies. Creatures from chaotic dimensions began entering ordered reality through these unguarded passages, while the dead escaped from underworld domains that were no longer properly supervised. These breaches in cosmic security created additional threats that diverted divine attention from the primary crisis. The acceleration of divine downfall reached critical momentum, as each failure created conditions that made further failures more likely and more severe. Gods who lost their domains became refugees dependent on the charity of siblings, who were themselves struggling for survival, creating additional strain on an already failing system. The interdependent nature of divine civilization meant that the collapse of any major component threatened the stability of all remaining elements. Emergency divine protocols that had been designed to preserve cosmic order during temporary crises proved inadequate for managing a fundamental challenge to the existence of divine authority itself. These protocols assumed that threats would be external to the divine system rather than emerging from within it, and they provided no guidance for situations where gods themselves had become the primary source of cosmic instability. The failure of these safeguards left divine civilization without any coherent strategy for managing existential threats. Multiple prophecies converging on the same catastrophic outcome revealed that the current crisis was not an accident or aberration, but the fulfillment of cosmic patterns that had been established since the foundation of divine rule. Ancient oracular utterances that had been dismissed as impossible paradoxes were suddenly recognized as accurate descriptions of events that were beginning to unfold with terrifying precision. These convergent prophecies suggested that divine downfall was inevitable rather than merely possible. Traditional mythology becoming obsolete occurred as events unfolded that had no precedent in divine history and could not be understood using established categories of cosmic analysis. The relationship between divine and mortal power was being redefined in ways that made ancient wisdom irrelevant and forced both gods and mortals to develop entirely new frameworks for understanding reality. This intellectual revolution was as significant as the political and military aspects of the crisis. The point where change became inevitable was reached when divine resistance to transformation began consuming more energy than adaptation would require, making continued opposition to change economically unsustainable even from a purely practical perspective. Gods who had committed themselves to preserving the old order discovered that their efforts were hastening its destruction rather than preventing it. This paradox forced even the most conservative divine beings to acknowledge that fundamental change had become unavoidable. Divine attempts at control failing comprehensively revealed the extent to which godly authority had always been based on illusion rather than actual power over cosmic forces. When these illusions were stripped away by the crisis, gods were revealed to be far less capable of controlling reality than they had claimed or believed. This exposure of divine limitations made resistance to change not just futile but counterproductive, as it wasted resources that might otherwise be used for adaptation to new cosmic conditions. The inevitability of divine transformation became apparent as cosmic forces beyond divine control began actively working to bring about changes that would restore balance to a universe that had become dangerously distorted by excessive divine dominance. These forces operated according to principles that transcended individual will or desire, making opposition to them equivalent to fighting against the fundamental nature of existence itself. The gods' choice was not whether change would occur, but whether they would participate constructively in that change or be destroyed by their resistance to it. The build-up to the ultimate divine showdown between Kratos and Ares transformed the city of Athens into a cosmic battleground where the fundamental laws governing reality would be tested to their breaking point. The very air crackled with supernatural energy as divine and mortal power prepared to clash in a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of individual combatants, but the future relationship between gods and mortals throughout all existence. Ancient buildings trembled with anticipation of violence that would exceed anything previously witnessed in the history of divine conflict. The detailed account of Deicide began when Kratos, empowered by the contents of Pandora's box, faced Ares in single combat, while the other gods watched from their celestial realm in stunned silence. The god of war had manifested in his full divine glory, a being of such terrible beauty and overwhelming power that his mere presence caused stone to crack and metal to melt. Yet the mortal warrior who stood before him showed no fear, only the cold determination of one who had been forged in the fires of betrayal and tempered by the hammer of divine manipulation. Ares struck first with a sword blow that should have cleaved mountains in half, but Kratos deflected the attack with movements that seemed to bend space itself around his weapons. The blades of chaos, once symbols of his servitude to the god of war, had been transformed by the power of Pandora's box into instruments capable of cutting through the very fabric of divine existence. Each clash of weapons sent shockwaves rippling through multiple dimensions, cracking the barriers between mortal and immortal realms. The realm-shaking combat that followed defied every assumption about the limitations of physical law and divine power. Buildings throughout Athens collapsed not from direct impact, but from the secondary effects of supernatural forces being unleashed without restraint. The sky itself began to bleed golden ichor, as the boundary between heaven and earth was damaged by the intensity of the conflict. Mortal witnesses fled in terror as reality warped around the combatants, creating zones where time moved differently and gravity operated according to altered principles. Divine flesh proved vulnerable to mortal steel when that steel was wielded by one who had transcended normal human limitations through a combination of divine enhancement and cosmic purpose. Each wound inflicted upon Ares sent sprays of golden blood across the battlefield, and with each drop that fell, the other gods felt their own invincibility diminish. The impossible was becoming reality as a mortal warrior demonstrated that divine beings could indeed be harmed, could indeed bleed, could indeed die. The choreography of cosmic destruction reached its crescendo as Ares, desperate to reclaim his superiority, began drawing power from sources that no god should touch. He tapped into primordial chaos itself, allowing forces older than Olympus to flow through his divine form in hopes of overwhelming his mortal opponent. This decision proved catastrophic as these ancient powers recognized no loyalty to individual gods and began consuming Ares from within, even as they increased his external strength. Kratos countered this escalation by fully embracing the power that Pandora's box had released within him, becoming not merely a mortal with divine weapons, but a living embodiment of the cosmic principle that demanded balance between different forms of power. His movements became fluid expressions of universal law, rather than simple combat techniques, while his strikes carried the weight of inevitable justice rather than mere physical force. He had become something beyond mortal or divine categories, a being that existed to correct the distortions that excessive divine dominance had created in the cosmic order. The moment of divine death arrived with shocking suddenness despite the epic nature of the battle that preceded it. Ares, weakened by his reckless use of primordial forces and overwhelmed by the relentless assault of an opponent who refused to acknowledge divine superiority, made a fatal mistake in his defensive positioning. The blade of the gods, manifested from pure cosmic justice, pierced his divine heart with a sound like reality itself, screaming in recognition of the unprecedented nature of the act. The light leaving the god of war's eyes marked the end of an age, and the beginning of something entirely new in the relationship between mortal and divine power. As Ares collapsed, his divine essence bleeding out onto Athenian stone, every god in every pantheon felt the shockwave of his death. The fundamental assumption that gods were beyond mortal reach had been shattered forever, making every divine being suddenly vulnerable to the possibility of their own destruction. Divine blood staining mortal ground for the first time in the history of creation created ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. The golden ichor that pooled beneath Ares's fallen form began to glow with an inner light that seemed to call out to cosmic forces that had been dormant since the foundation of the current world order. Ancient powers stirred in response to this unprecedented event, recognizing it as a signal that the time for fundamental change had finally arrived. The cosmic stakes of the divine battle became fully apparent as the death of Ares triggered a cascade of supernatural events that threatened to unravel the entire structure of organized reality. Divine magic began failing across multiple realms, as the mystical networks that had sustained godly civilization lost their primary source of martial energy. Temples dedicated to war and conflict throughout the ancient world spontaneously burst into flame as their connection to divine authority was severed by their patron's death. The critical moment reshaping all mythology occurred when Kratos, standing over the fallen form of the god of war, was offered Ares's throne and position within the Olympian hierarchy. This moment represented more than personal vindication, but the formal recognition by divine authority that mortal power could indeed challenge and replace godly dominance when backed by sufficient justice and determination. The acceptance of this offer would transform Kratos from god-killer into god, completing a transformation that had begun with his family's murder. The final moments of the battle echoed across all divine realms as gods throughout creation recognized that a fundamental law of existence had been overturned. The death of Ares was not merely a personal tragedy or political setback, but a cosmic revolution that redefined the possible relationships between different forms of power and authority. Every divine being suddenly found themselves vulnerable to challenges that had previously been impossible, while mortals throughout the world began to sense that their relationship with the gods had been permanently altered. The installation of Kratos as the new god of war represented both the culmination of his quest for vengeance and the beginning of a new phase in divine evolution. His acceptance of divine status was reluctant and conflicted, as he had achieved his primary goal of destroying Ares, but found himself trapped within the same system of divine authority that had originally betrayed him. This ironic outcome suggested that the cycle of divine corruption and rebellion would continue, with new players but the same fundamental dynamics. The immediate aftermath of Deicide revealed that killing a god created power vacuums that could not be easily filled, even when a replacement was immediately available. The domains that Ares had controlled began to operate chaotically, without proper divine oversight, while the mystical forces he had managed started to spiral out of control. These consequences demonstrated that divine power was not merely personal authority, but an essential component of cosmic infrastructure whose disruption threatened universal stability. The transformation of divine politics following the successful challenge to godly authority created new uncertainties and possibilities that no one was fully prepared to manage. Gods who had previously felt secure in their positions suddenly began to question their own vulnerability, while mortals throughout the world started to wonder whether their prayers and sacrifices were truly necessary for beings who could apparently be killed by sufficiently determined opposition. The precedent established by Kratos' victory over Ares would prove to be the most significant event in the history of divine-mortal relations, creating a new understanding of power dynamics that would eventually lead to the complete transformation of cosmic authority. The night when Olympus first trembled marked not just the death of a single god, but the beginning of a revolution that would ultimately consume every divine being who refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of mortal grievances against divine rule. The chaos that followed the death of Ares and the ascension of Kratos to divine status created unprecedented disruptions throughout the cosmic order that governing divine and mortal relations for millennia. The other gods found themselves grappling with the psychological trauma of witnessing one of their own killed by a mortal, while simultaneously trying to understand the implications of accepting that same mortal into their ranks as an equal. This paradox created cognitive dissonance that made rational decision-making nearly impossible for beings who had never before confronted their own mortality. Surviving gods and mortals developed vastly different coping strategies for managing the new reality in which divine invincibility had been proven false and mortal determination had been demonstrated capable of challenging cosmic authority. Zeus retreated into paranoid isolation, surrounding himself with layers of protective magic and trusted guards while obsessively studying prophecies for signs of future threats. Athena embraced the change as an opportunity for divine evolution, arguing that gods who survived mortal challenges would become stronger and more worthy of their positions. The power vacuum created by Ares' death in the divine hierarchy proved impossible to fill completely, despite Kratos' formal assumption of the god of war's throne and responsibilities. The new deity lacked the centuries of experience necessary for managing the complex mystical networks that sustained divine control over warfare and conflict throughout the mortal realm. His attempts to fulfill these responsibilities were hampered by his fundamentally different approach to divine authority and his reluctance to engage in the political maneuvering that had characterized his predecessor's reign. New threats emerging from the ruins of the old divine order included primordial forces that had been kept dormant by the careful balance of Olympian power, but were now stirring in response to the fundamental changes in cosmic authority. Ancient entities that predated divine civilization began to probe the weakened barriers that had previously contained them, while chaotic spirits that fed on divine instability started manifesting in regions where godly control had been disrupted by the recent crisis. The immediate divine implications of accepting a former mortal into their ranks forced the gods to confront fundamental questions about the nature of divinity itself that they had never previously needed to address. If godhood could be achieved through the defeat of existing gods rather than inherited through divine lineage, then what exactly distinguished gods from exceptionally powerful mortals? This question threatened the entire ideological foundation upon which divine authority was based, and suggested that many basic assumptions about cosmic order might need to be reconsidered. Unexpected divine problems emerged from the solution of installing Kratos as Ares' replacement, as the new god's different approach to managing warfare created disruptions in established patterns of divine intervention in mortal conflicts. Where Ares had gloried in prolonged battles and maximum destruction, Kratos favored quick, decisive victories that minimized collateral damage. This change in divine methodology disrupted the strategies of mortal commanders who had learned to rely on predictable patterns of divine influence in their military planning. New mythological threats began manifesting as the cosmic balance that had been maintained through centuries of divine cooperation started to shift in response to the changes in divine personnel and philosophy. Creatures that had been contained through collaborative divine effort began escaping their prisons as gods became too distracted by internal concerns to maintain proper vigilance. Ancient curses that had been held in check by divine counterspells started activating as the magical networks that sustained them were disrupted by the recent changes. The suggestion that divine consequences were just beginning became apparent as reports reached Olympus of similar challenges to divine authority emerging in other pantheons throughout the world. The example set by Kratos' successful rebellion had inspired mortal champions in distant lands to challenge their own gods, while divine beings everywhere began to experience unprecedented levels of mortal resistance to their traditional demands for worship and obedience. The revolution that had begun in Greece was spreading to become a global phenomenon. Current Pantheon state reflected a system in crisis, as gods struggled to adapt to new realities while maintaining their traditional roles and responsibilities. Divine councils, that had once been characterized by confident cooperation, became exercises in mutual suspicion and defensive positioning. Gods who had previously taken their invincibility for granted began developing elaborate security protocols and backup plans for scenarios they had never imagined possible. Recent mythological developments included the spontaneous generation of new prophetic visions that spoke of further changes to come in the cosmic order, suggesting that the death of Ares was merely the first event in a larger pattern of divine transformation. Oracles throughout the ancient world began receiving visions of marked warriors and fallen gods, while ancient texts that had been dismissed as metaphorical began manifesting literal fulfillment in ways that terrified scholars and priests. The divine status quo proved unsustainable, as gods discovered that the old methods of maintaining authority through fear and intimidation were no longer effective against populations that had witnessed successful mortal rebellion against divine power. Temples that had once been centers of unquestioning worship became venues for theological debate about the legitimacy of divine rule, while priests found themselves forced to defend doctrines that had previously been accepted without question. Immediate divine implications of the crisis extended beyond the Greek pantheon to affect the cosmic infrastructure that supported all divine civilizations throughout the universe. The mystical networks that connected different pantheons began experiencing disruptions as the fundamental assumptions underlying their operation were challenged by recent events. Gods from distant mythologies found their own power bases weakening in sympathy with the breakdown of Olympian authority. Contemporary divine relevance became a crucial issue as gods were forced to justify their continued existence and authority to mortal populations that had grown skeptical of divine claims to wisdom and benevolence. The old model of unquestioning worship in exchange for vague promises of divine protection no longer satisfied mortals who had seen that gods could be held accountable for their actions through direct confrontation. Current scholarly debates among divine theologians and mortal philosophers centered on the question of whether the recent events represented temporary disruptions in an otherwise stable cosmic order, or permanent changes that required fundamental revisions to basic understanding of divine-mortal relations. Conservative scholars argued that the anomalous nature of Kratos' transformation made it an exception that proved the rule of divine supremacy, while radical thinkers claimed that it demonstrated the artificial nature of divine authority and the possibility of establishing more equitable relationships between different forms of cosmic power. The ongoing divine investigations into the circumstances surrounding Ares' death revealed disturbing evidence that the entire sequence of events had been orchestrated by cosmic forces that operated beyond divine detection or control. The precision with which events had unfolded to produce exactly the outcome necessary for successful divine challenge suggested intelligent design by entities whose motivations and capabilities remained mysterious even to the gods themselves. How the mystery affected current realms became apparent as divine territories throughout the cosmos began experiencing similar patterns of instability and challenge that had preceded the Greek crisis. Gods everywhere found themselves facing unprecedented levels of mortal resistance and internal dissent, while the mystical forces that sustained divine civilization showed signs of strain that threatened complete systemic collapse if not addressed through fundamental reforms rather than traditional responses. The emergence of new categories of beings that existed between mortal and divine states created additional complications for cosmic governance systems that had been designed to accommodate only two basic types of conscious entities. Kratos represented the first of what appeared to be a new class of cosmic citizens whose existence challenged traditional categories and required the development of entirely new frameworks for understanding power, authority, and responsibility within the universal order. The mythological legacy of divine murder persisted across centuries and civilizations as the story of Kratos killing Ares became embedded in the collective consciousness of mortals throughout the ancient world and beyond. This tale transcended cultural boundaries and religious traditions, inspiring countless variations and interpretations that all shared the common theme of mortal rebellion against divine tyranny. The fundamental message that gods could be held accountable for their actions spread like wildfire through populations that had long suffered under capricious divine rule without hope of recourse. Cultural and religious impact on mortals manifested in revolutionary changes to worship practices and theological understanding that fundamentally altered the relationship between human beings and divine authority. Traditional prayers of supplication were increasingly replaced by demands for divine accountability, while sacrificial rituals began including symbolic elements that reminded gods of their vulnerability to mortal opposition. Temples that had once been designed to inspire awe and submission were rebuilt to emphasize the dignity and power of worshippers rather than the overwhelming superiority of divine beings. Ongoing conflicts from divine fall created persistent instabilities throughout the cosmic order, as the power structures that had maintained universal balance for millennia struggled to adapt to new realities. Divine territories that had been stable for centuries began experiencing regular upheavals as local gods found their authority challenged by mortals, inspired by the Greek example. These regional conflicts often escalated into broader disruptions that affected international trade, diplomatic relations, and military alliances throughout the ancient world. Hidden divine survivors plotting revenge against the new cosmic order began organizing resistance movements that operated through secret networks spanning multiple pantheons and geographical regions. These conspiracies included displaced gods who had lost their domains to mortal rebellion, ambitious divine beings who sought to exploit the chaos for personal advantage, and conservative deities who believed that divine authority could be restored through sufficiently brutal suppression of mortal pretensions to equality. The significance of Deicide in the current God of War world extended far beyond its immediate historical impact to become a defining principle that shaped the fundamental nature of reality itself. The precedent established by Kratos' victory over Ares created cosmic conditions that made further challenges to divine authority not just possible, but inevitable, as universal forces moved to correct imbalances that had accumulated over millennia of unopposed divine dominance. Role in ongoing realm conflicts became apparent as the death of Ares triggered a cascade of supernatural events that destabilized divine territories throughout the cosmos and created opportunities for previously suppressed forces to assert themselves. Ancient entities that had been contained by divine cooperation began breaking free from their prisons, while primordial powers that predated current cosmic order started manifesting in ways that threatened the continued existence of organized reality. How Deicide shaped mortal and divine relations involved fundamental changes in the psychological and spiritual dynamics that governed interactions between human beings and supernatural forces. Mortals who had previously approached gods as supplicants seeking favor began treating them as equals, demanding justice, while divine beings found themselves forced to justify their actions and decisions in ways that had never been required before the precedent of divine accountability was established. Why divine murder mattered to remaining pantheons became clear as gods throughout the world recognized that their own survival depended on adapting to new expectations for divine behavior that had been established by recent events. Pantheons that failed to reform their practices in response to changing cosmic conditions found themselves facing increasingly effective mortal resistance, while those that embraced accountability and cooperation with human populations were able to maintain their authority through consent rather than intimidation. Long-term implications for all realms included the gradual transformation of cosmic governance from authoritarian divine rule to more collaborative forms of universal management that recognized the legitimate interests and capabilities of mortal beings. This evolution was not smooth or uniform, but occurred through a series of conflicts and negotiations that reshaped the fundamental structure of reality according to principles of justice and balance rather than mere power. How changes affected divine future involved the emergence of new categories of cosmic citizenship that transcended traditional distinctions between mortal and immortal states of existence. Beings like Kratos who existed between these categories became increasingly common as the rigid hierarchies that had previously defined cosmic order gave way to more fluid and dynamic forms of organization that recognized merit and justice rather than inherited status. Precedents set by recent events established new protocols for cosmic governance that would influence the development of divine-mortal relations for millennia to come. The principle that divine authority must be earned through wisdom and service rather than claimed through force became embedded in cosmic law, while the right of mortals to challenge unjust divine actions was recognized as a fundamental aspect of universal justice. Likely mythological developments suggested that the transformation initiated by Ares's death would continue to unfold through a series of similar challenges to divine authority throughout the cosmos until a new equilibrium was established between different forms of power and consciousness. This process would be painful and destructive but necessary for the creation of a more just and sustainable cosmic order. Divine influence, proving eternal, manifested through the lasting impact of Ares's death on cosmic consciousness and the fundamental principles governing reality itself. Even after the immediate crisis had passed and new forms of order had been established, the memory of divine vulnerability continued to shape relationships between powerful beings and those subject to their authority throughout all levels of existence. Effects beyond mortal comprehension included changes to the basic structure of space and time that resulted from the introduction of previously impossible concepts into cosmic reality. The death of an immortal being created paradoxes that required fundamental revisions to universal law, while the transformation of a mortal into a god established precedents that challenged basic categories of existence and identity. Hints at effects beyond mortal comprehension suggested that the full consequences of divine murder would continue to unfold across cosmic scales and time frames that exceeded human ability to perceive or understand. The ripple effects of Kratos' victory over Ares would influence the development of consciousness and civilization throughout the universe for eons to come, creating possibilities and challenges that could not be anticipated by any existing form of intelligence. The suggestion that divine cycles might repeat emerged from analysis of cosmic patterns that suggested the events surrounding Ares's death were part of larger cycles of transformation that occurred periodically throughout universal history. These cycles appeared to serve cosmic functions related to the prevention of excessive concentration of power and the maintenance of dynamic balance between different forms of consciousness and authority. Evidence that divine story was far from over appeared in prophetic visions and mystical revelations that spoke of further challenges to come for both gods and mortals as the cosmos continued to evolve toward new forms of organization and understanding. The transformation initiated by divine murder was revealed to be merely the beginning of a much larger process of cosmic evolution that would ultimately reshape the fundamental nature of existence itself. The implications as world-changing extended beyond immediate political and religious consequences to encompass fundamental alterations in the nature of reality that would affect every aspect of existence throughout all possible worlds and dimensions. The precedent of successful mortal rebellion against divine authority had introduced new possibilities into cosmic reality that would continue to generate unexpected consequences for eternity, ensuring that the universe would never again return to the static hierarchies that had previously defined the relationship between different forms of power and consciousness. Modern discoveries that continue to reshape our understanding of the knight Kratos, first spilled divine blood, emerge from archaeological excavations and mystical investigations that reveal previously unknown aspects of this cosmic turning point. Ancient tablets, recently unearthed from beneath ruined temples, speak of cosmic mechanisms that were activated by Ares's death, while mystical artifacts discovered in hidden chambers contain prophecies that suggest the god of war's demise was merely the first note in a symphony of divine transformation that will continue to unfold across millennia. How the past events of divine murder continue to influence the present becomes apparent through examination of ongoing supernatural phenomena that can be traced directly to the moment when mortal steel first pierced immortal flesh. The barriers between different realms of existence remain permanently weakened by the cosmic shockwaves generated by Deicide, allowing energies and entities to cross dimensional boundaries with unprecedented ease. These continuing effects suggest that the assassination of Ares created permanent changes in the fundamental structure of reality itself. What this story means for realm futures extends beyond simple historical precedent to encompass fundamental alterations in the cosmic order that will shape the development of consciousness and civilization throughout all possible worlds. The principle that authority must be earned through justice rather than claimed through force has become embedded in universal law, ensuring that future attempts to establish tyrannical dominance will face increasingly effective resistance from those subjected to unjust rule. Connections to other Pantheon threats reveal that the example set by Kratos' successful rebellion has inspired similar movements throughout the cosmic community of divine beings, creating a network of resistance that spans multiple mythologies and geographical regions. Egyptian gods report increasing challenges from mortal champions, blessed with unusual powers, while Norse deities speak in hushed tones of prophetic warnings about marked warriors who will bring about the twilight of their own divine age. The divine story proving far from over manifests through continuing revelations about cosmic forces that were awakened by Ares's death and remain active in shaping events throughout the universe. Ancient powers that had slumbered since the foundation of current reality have begun to stir in response to the fundamental changes in cosmic balance, while primordial entities that predate all known forms of divine authority have started to manifest in ways that suggest their intention to reclaim roles in cosmic governance. Modern connections to larger mythology become apparent through analysis of prophetic patterns that link the death of Ares to other significant events in divine history, revealing a cosmic narrative that spans ages and involves the gradual transformation of universal order according to principles that transcend individual will or desire. The assassination of the god of war appears to be one episode in an ongoing cosmic drama that will ultimately reshape the fundamental nature of existence itself. Why understanding this moment matters now relates to its continued influence on current events and future possibilities throughout all realms of existence. The precedent of successful divine challenge continues to inspire mortal resistance movements while simultaneously forcing divine beings to evolve beyond their traditional authoritarian approaches to cosmic governance. Understanding this historical moment provides crucial insight into the forces that continue to shape contemporary supernatural conflicts. Future divine developments that remain possible include the emergence of new forms of cosmic citizenship that transcend traditional categories of mortal and immortal existence. The transformation of Kratos from human warrior to divine being established precedents for consciousness evolution that suggest similar metamorphoses may become increasingly common as the universe continues to develop toward greater complexity and integration. How Deicide connects to larger mythology involves recognition of cyclical patterns in cosmic history that suggest divine authority is subject to the same forces of change and renewal that affect all other aspects of existence. The death of Ares represents one iteration of a universal cycle that has operated since the beginning of time and will continue to generate transformative events until consciousness itself evolves beyond the need for external authority. Final thoughts on cosmic significance emphasize that the night Olympus first trembled marks a fundamental transition in universal history, comparable to the emergence of consciousness itself, or the formation of the first divine beings. This moment represents the universe becoming aware of its own potential for self-transformation and beginning to actively participate in its own evolution toward greater justice and balance. The suggestion that the divine story remains far from over appears in prophetic visions that speak of additional challenges to come for both gods and mortals as cosmic evolution continues to unfold according to patterns that exceed individual comprehension. The transformation initiated by divine murder will continue to generate unexpected consequences across scales of time and space that challenge existing categories of understanding. Implications presented as world-changing extend beyond immediate political and religious consequences to encompass fundamental alterations in the nature of consciousness and reality that will affect every aspect of existence throughout all possible dimensions. The precedent of successful mortal rebellion against divine tyranny has introduced new possibilities into cosmic reality that will continue to generate transformative events for eternity. The potential for Pantheon development suggests that divine civilizations throughout the universe will be forced to undergo similar processes of transformation and accountability as cosmic evolution continues to unfold. Gods who refuse to adapt to new expectations for divine behavior will find themselves facing increasingly effective opposition, while those who embrace reform and cooperation may discover new forms of cosmic authority based on service rather than dominance. Why recent events reshape everything becomes clear through recognition that the death of Ares established precedents for cosmic justice that cannot be reversed or ignored. The principle that power must be exercised responsibly and can be challenged when it becomes corrupt has become embedded in universal law, ensuring that future attempts to establish absolute authority will face systematic resistance from cosmic forces dedicated to maintaining balance and preventing tyranny. The contemplation of implications for the future of all realms and pantheons reveals that the assassination of Ares initiated a process of cosmic transformation that will continue to unfold until new forms of universal organization emerge that better serve the interests of all conscious beings. This evolution will be painful and destructive, but necessary for the creation of a more just and sustainable cosmic order that recognizes the dignity and potential of every form of consciousness. The final statement that ties this subject to larger God of War mythology emphasizes that the night when divine blood first stained mortal ground represents the moment when the universe began to awaken to its own potential for self-directed evolution and conscious participation in its own development toward greater justice and wisdom. Kratos did not merely kill a god, but initiated a cosmic revolution that will continue to unfold across ages until reality itself becomes a more perfect expression of universal justice. In the end, the story of how a Spartan warrior became the first mortal to spill divine blood reveals itself to be more than historical chronicle. But prophecy still in the process of fulfillment. The Ghost of Sparta did not simply seek vengeance against divine betrayal, but became the instrument through which the universe began to correct fundamental imbalances that had accumulated over millennia of unopposed divine dominance. His victory over Ares marked the beginning of a new age, in which consciousness itself would become an active participant in cosmic evolution, ensuring that the future of all realms would be shaped by principles of justice rather than mere power. The night Olympus trembled was the night the universe itself began to dream of transformation, and those dreams continue to reshape reality with each passing moment.